places in Hans Jonas's work that he seems to prioritize not harming over benefiting. I think that's a mistake. I've already suggested it has very conservative implications. In fact, if you literally take as your moral mandate avoiding harm, just never do anything and you'll never hurt anybody. You'll never help anybody either, but at its extreme, prioritizing non-maleficence is really irrational. So I've differed somewhat with Hans Jonas, although I respect his moral intuitions not to probe into certain high technology, innovative science until we're comfortable that we have some level of grasp, I would say, of the risk-benefit ratio rather than just of the harms.
It's been a source of concern that the focus of research with human subjects, the focus of the ethical issues, is shifting from consent to risk assessment, particularly with the rise in learning healthcare systems. And I wonder what you think of this paradigm shift, if it in fact is a trend to be watching and worried about.
Well, I'm worried about it. There are many manifestations of the shift. I take it it's obvious that for any applied ethical decision, including all of medicine and medical research, the first premise is you have to have some basis for believing you'll do more good than harm. But once you have that as your premise, I would see the protection of the principle of autonomy and respect for persons, as well as the principle of justice, the other two principles of Belmont, if you like, to be absolutely critical. No amount of maximizing of benefit-risk ratios would justify the infringement on respect for persons or the infringement on justice. I've had a long-term interest in the application of the principle of justice in research design as well as in subject selection. Belmont opens the door to the principle of justice. It includes it, but in a very minor way. It focuses on justice in subject selection, as is appropriate given the immediate prehistory of the Tuskegee study and my birth control study that I referred to. We have a long history of taking the most available and defenseless people as our research subjects, and surely any concern with justice requires that we look very carefully at the fair selection of subjects. But I'm also interested in the problem of justice in research design. I'm interested in cases where, say, there are two ways you can design an experiment. One of them is incredibly elegant science, but the effect is it imposes a rather substantial burden on subjects. The alternative is slightly less elegant science, but much less burden on the subjects. Where I actually developed my thinking on this was a research protocol that was studying patients at the end of life, and the elegant design would have required that patients who were very near death spend 3 days out of every 21 for the rest of their lives in the hospital. The alternative, a little less elegant science, was to let the patients spend those 3 days at home and send a visiting nurse in to administer the drugs at home. The scientists were worried, well, if they're at home, we have less control over the environment. It's not as good as science. My counter argument, yes, it's not quite as good science, but you're dealing with subjects who are among the worst off in our society. Here's the Rawlsian in me coming out concerned about the worst off. If people who are terminally ill are among the worst off in society, we owe it to them to take into account their interests in designing the research. And obviously you don't ruin the science. If it were useless science that resulted, don't go that route. But the amount of compromise that occurred in my illustration of letting these patients stay at home for the remaining days of their lives and have a nurse administer the drug on a visiting basis was such a small compromise with the research design that I insisted that the researchers make that compromise in the name of justice, even though the researchers were throwing up their hands saying it's not perfect science. Well, it's not perfect science, but forcing dying people to spend a big chunk of the rest of their lives in a hospital isn't ethically very good either. So we make some compromises in research design, and I'm suggesting we do so not only in the name of respect for patient autonomy, but also in the name of justice. I might not have demanded the same compromise if the patients were healthy, normal subjects who didn't have Rawlsian justice-based claims on their side. But these patients, I thought, deserved having us go out of our way to make sure the design burdened them as little as possible. It's not something I've worked directly on, but it's always been my view that researchers are human beings, and as human beings, we owe something especially to those who are worst off. I think a reasonable level of commitment to the service of research subjects and the interests of research subjects is the minimum we can ask of any scientist. So within the constraints of budget and time, I would certainly expect investigators to pay back, if you like. Investigators are asking a great deal of their research subjects, and particularly if the research subjects are among the worst off in the community, all of us owe something to those people. If the researcher can provide a quid pro quo, I think there's an ethical obligation to do so. I've always favored the idea that the investigator's ethical obligation doesn't end with the publishing of the paper. Most obviously, investigators owe to their subjects a report about what they found. And to the extent that what they found can benefit the subject, there is a residual obligation to go out of your way to some extent to see that the subjects continue to get the benefit. For example, I've always been a believer that those of us who work in the ethics of human subjects protection are morally required to become research subjects ourselves from time to time. I happen to have been a research subject in a major NIH study that was the trial of the shingles vaccine. Needed normal subjects at my age, and I volunteered to be a research subject. Now, it was the nature of that protocol that half the subjects would get a placebo, half would get the real vaccine. And to their credit, the researchers committed to the view that if the research pans out and the vaccine prevents shingles, and you receive the placebo, you will have the opportunity to come in and get the real vaccine. Now, it turns out that that was also good science because they continued to follow those people, but the duty to get the treatment to the subject is within reason, I think, part of what investigators owe to the subject. And particularly in a vaccine kind of trial, it's a fairly minimal burden on the investigator to give your placebo arm subjects an opportunity to get the trial, to get the active ingredient once it proves beneficial. Now, I could go further if you want, but it may take us off the subject. I also believe that in many cases, investigators owe to subjects during the trial a right of non-randomized access to the experimental arm of the trial in the case where the subject can give a reason why he or she prefers the experimental arm to the placebo arm. Now, this is heresy in medical research, and it can mess up certain trials, but I've spent a long time working on that issue, and I believe that most of the arguments against offering the non-randomized access make sense. It's my view that subjects may rationally prefer one of the arms of a trial, even though investigators, quite honestly, are in equipoise between the two arms. And individual subjects may prefer one or the other because they have idiosyncratic evaluations of the benefits or the harms. Right now, in today's science, if you prefer the standard treatment, you have an absolute right to get it because you'll be asked to consent to be in the randomized trial. If you refuse to be in the randomized trial, you're sent off to your doctor who is going to give you the standard treatment. But if you rationally prefer the experimental arm, right now you can't get it. And most scientists say it's irrational to prefer the experimental arm because we're in equipoise. But as long as you understand, subjects may evaluate, the subject may be a high roller, for example, may say, when it comes to life choices, I always like to take chances. I would be very uncomfortable getting the standard treatment. I understand there are real risks, but I want to gamble. I want to go ahead and try the experimental arm. Right now, if the drug is not on the market for some other use, there's no way you can legally get access to the experimental arm. I think we owe it to subjects to give them access to the experimental arm, provided we can document that they're adequately informed and they understand many clinicians aren't ready to use this therapy. I go one step further. I argue that it's even better science to give access to the experimental arm on a non-randomized basis. The argument is a little long. I don't know if you want me to go into it.
How about the Cliff Notes version?
The Cliff Notes version is, if you set up a trial that I call a semi-randomized design, you actually end up with 4 arms. Those randomized to control group, those randomized to the experimental group. Those 2 arms produce the data you're going to send to the FDA, just like you do now. But if you have 2 more arms, you have the person who insists on the control, who right now is not followed. He's sent off to his local clinician. Then you'd also have the person who prefers the experimental arm. Collect data on those 2 arms, and you now have information to test the hypothesis that those randomized to the experimental group produce the same results of those who insist on the experimental group. Because eventually we're going to use this agent by telling the patient, this is a good drug, it's good for you, here's what I'm prescribing. It's very important to know that the result from the experimental randomized consumer of that agent produces the same results as those who take it already believing it's best for them. Now, most of the time, you'll end up showing the results of the two arms are the same, the experimental randomized group and the experimental non-randomized group. But once in a while, and I collect evidence that this is the case, once in a while, the non-randomized group produces a different result from the group randomized to the same drug. And if that happens, it's absolutely essential that we know that fact. Therefore, I'm arguing it's better science if you can follow these two non-randomized arms. I call it a semi-randomized design. There's an easy part and a hard part to the question of compensation for injury in research. The easy part is, as part of the consent process, the subject needs to be told what the deal is. If your view is, even though you're paralyzed for life, I take no responsibility, even though my research caused it, if that's your view of things and you're not going to take responsibility, at least you tell the patient or the subject that that's what the arrangement is. Now, the hard part is, it seems to me, again, to take up this issue of what we owe subjects in exchange for the service the subject provides to a researcher. I think what we owe the subject is some form of insurance for compensation of injury that might occur. I understand there's some kinds of effects where it's very hard to show whether the research caused the effect or something else caused the effect. But I would favor a policy that investigators are expected to provide research insurance for all their research subject that would cover those things that are identified in the research policy. Insurance companies are good at spelling out what they cover and what they don't cover, and I would like to see, ideally, every research subject given as part of the deal for volunteering an insurance policy that provides compensation for injury that occurs during the research.
I know that you have served as an expert witness in several legal cases on the question of consent and its adequacy. And I'd love for you to describe what, in your considered, learned opinion, makes consent adequate.
The formal answer is pretty straightforward. Consent is adequate if you tell the subject what a reasonable subject would want to know. That's empirically testable by, if you have a tough problem, you draw a group of subjects as if you were starting the research, and you give them a list of things that they might be told, and you find out empirically what they want to be told. So you must to have an adequately informed consent, you tell them what the reasonable subject would want to know, plus or minus what the specific subject would have a unique subjective interest in knowing. And that will come either by the subject conveying to the investigator, I'm really worried about X, Y, and Z. Tell me more about this activity. I'm planning a trip around the world next month. Is there any way that my being in this study would cause me even a remote chance of not being able to go on the trip? That would be a subjective piece of information that subjects might signal to an investigator. So anything the subject signals, or in other ways the investigator ought to understand is a unique interest of the subject. Now, it must be clear that doesn't mean fully informed consent. When I hear an investigator tell me as an IRB member that she's getting fully informed consent, I get very nervous because no rational person wants all the information, wants to know the chemical structure of the compound and so forth, wants to know all the data from all the animal studies. Reasonable people don't want all of that. What they want is what reasonable people would want to know, adjusted for the subjective interests of the subject insofar as the investigator has reason to understand what those interests are.
You mentioned that you had been an IRB member, and I read that in fact you've been a member of 6 IRBs over the years, including
right.
the super IRB at NIH that re-reviewed a sample of protocols that had been reviewed by various IRBs at the different extramural institutions to look for inconsistencies. And I'd love to hear a little bit about that work, if you would.
Well, it's true, I've been on 6 IRBs, counting what I call the super IRB, and they're remarkably different. A little in-house IRB at the Hastings Center, very active IRB at Montefiore Hospital that I was on for close to a decade. Hundreds, maybe thousands of protocols were reviewed. I learned the ethics of human subjects protection from a very wise chair of that IRB, Vic Seidel, a dear friend who I respect enormously. I was on the NIOSH IRB, which is a government research center for occupational health and safety. They have an in-house IRB that reviews all of their research projects, and I was on that IRB for a number of years. I chaired the Georgetown Social Science IRB. If you want to deal with investigators who get very defensive when questions of ethics arise, you have to deal with social scientists, psychologists, sociologists who quickly trot out the old chestnuts about academic freedom when you raise questions about consent and deception research, for example. What I called the super IRB was technically, I suppose, not an IRB. At NIH, there are 15 research institutes. Each one has its own IRB for its internal research projects. They began to discover at NIH that there were inconsistencies from one of these IRBs to another. So in their wisdom, I thought it was a wonderful idea, they drew a random sample of the research protocols that these 15 IRBs had reviewed and assigned them to a made-up quasi-IRB of people who were expert in the field, were put there because of their particular knowledge of human subjects research, either research design or, in my case, the ethics of human subjects research. And we re-reviewed to try to identify patterns and particularly places where there were differences from one IRB to another. It was a fascinating piece of work, and I hope it helped the NIH sort out to make their IRB work more consistent. NIH has a clinical center where a lot of their in-house clinical research is done. And in, I suppose, the 1990s, it was a period where hospitals were forming ethics committees to consult on ethically problematic clinical cases. Now, these were patients who were all involved in research projects, but often the ethical problem wasn't exactly a problem of research ethics. When they formed this ethics committee, like many hospitals have, I was engaged to spend a period of over a year, maybe 2 years, doing the education of the ethics committee, where we worked through everything from theories of ethics to notions of informed consent and kinds of problems that an ethics committee might have. Now, one of the intriguing ethical problems that arose at NIH was the conflict between the research agenda and respect for the patient as a patient. A typical problem would be an investigator is invested maybe 6 months in a patient, giving them special treatments of one sort or another, and the patient finally says, I've had enough. I want to exercise my right to refuse further treatment. I want to be allowed to die. I want to transfer to a hospice. Well, this really messes up the research. And yet, respect for the patient clearly gives that patient the right to drop out of the protocol. It led to discussions of questions like, when you recruit subjects, do you offer them incentives that are linked to being the research subject? A patient doesn't go into the clinical center at NIH unless they're in a research protocol. What do you do when the patient gets there and almost immediately says, I'm done with research, just take care of me? That was the kind of special research-related problem that the ethics committee at the clinical center was worried about. And I helped in the education of the committee to work through that problem. There's also a bioethics department at NIH, which has a fellowship program, pre- and postdoctoral fellowships. And for many, many years, I've been one of the presenters in the seminar for the pre- and postdoctoral fellowship. Then there's also the random conference or seminar where I've been invited to come in. I did a session not terribly long ago on different definitions of death and how that affects the work of the NIH. The Hastings Center is the best place in the world for a young academic where the staff positions are partly administrative, and to the extent you do writing, you write the consensus of your research group. Eventually, young staff, if they're imaginative, want to go off on their own. And after almost 10 years at the Hastings Center, I reached the point where I wanted to do more sustained work with my own ideas. And it turned out that there was a position opening at the Kennedy Institute, and I was in conversation with Andre Helligers, as well as Leroy Walters, about a move to the Kennedy Institute where the model of work is really quite different. The Kennedy Institute is first and foremost a research institute where we have full-time faculty who are basically turned loose to do their own work. It's another dream job. I've had 2 dream jobs in my career. Now, the Kennedy Institute also contributes to teaching. I teach in the philosophy department, and I'm some at the medical school here at Georgetown. But as a research institute, our mandate is to go to work and do the best sustained major pieces of work you can do. And I've been doing that for the last 35 years. One of the products was a book entitled The Patient as Partner, A Theory of Human Experimentation Ethics, where I tried to set out a sustained and systematic theory of the ethics of human subjects research. You couldn't do something like that at Hastings because it took years of work, first in writing some articles and then in synthesizing those articles, putting them into book form. Here at the Kennedy Institute, I was able to devote more or less full-time to the production of that book, and others generally looking at the problem of the rights of outgroups, patients' rights, subjects' rights, and the tensions between facts and values, and the thesis that expertise on the facts doesn't give you expertise on the values in decision-making in medicine.
When you wrote The Patient as Partner in 1987, I believe, that was considered to be the first systematic exploration of research with human subjects and the ethics of research with human subjects. What are the principal differences between your observations and research then and your observations on the state of ethics with human subjects circa 2014, some 27 years later?
In the world of biomedical ethics, we note that medicine changes very rapidly and ethics progresses very slowly. We still rely on the Greeks and the Old Testament and various Eastern traditions that have literally been with us for millennia. I'm still remarkably comfortable with the theory that I outlined in that first volume of The Patient as Partner. Actually, 2 volumes, one on human experimentation ethics and one on the ethics of clinical medicine. But The Patient as Partner, the first volume on human experimentation ethics, I'm still very comfortable with what's there. Some of these basic ideas about semi-randomized design and the rights of patients to get information are all in that volume, and I'm still committed to that general theory. I have never devoted sustained, deep attention to problems of international research. I'm well aware of the issues, and I've generally been committed to the notion that if an American is doing the research or Americans are funding the research, the requirements are that it meet the norms of the country where the research is being done and American norms. If those norms in the 2 countries are mutually exclusive, we're in a bind. I don't think that research can be done, or at least I'm not willing to approve it. I'm deeply troubled by projects where the subjects are drawn, say, from a tribal culture, where notions of community consent are proposed so that the individual may not be informed, but the elders of the community might be. I believe if you want to do that research, you have to meet the American standard of individual consent. And if you're an American or doing it with American money, that's our norm. If somebody in another country chooses to do it another way, I don't have leverage. I'm enough of an individualist, modern Westerner that I think individual consent is absolutely necessary. And I'm not willing to waive consent, generally not willing to waive consent for any reason, certainly not the reasons that are implied in the current regulations. One of the conditions in current regulations for waiving consent is that the rights of the subject are protected. In my view, one of the rights of the subject is to be adequately informed, and therefore you can't waive consent and still meet those requirements. I would apply that for international research as well. I recently was asked to give the Henry Beecher Lecture for the Hastings Center, and I chose to focus on the contributions of Henry Beecher, including the ways that I thought he was seriously mistaken. And I ended up with the thesis that Henry Beecher has probably done more to advance the ethics of medicine, not only human subjects research, but with the definition of death and his work on placebos and the like. He's probably done more to advance the discussions of the ethics of medicine than anybody else in history. But he still got some things wrong, and it's a mark of our progress in medical ethics that today, while his entreating investigators to take personal responsibility for their work, we now know that that just isn't adequate, that we need a multidisciplinary, multicultural perspective of the sort that comes from institutional review boards, ideally institutional review boards in a very pluralistic setting. So I have enormous admiration for Henry Beecher. He was my mentor at Harvard, my colleague and mentor at the Hastings Center. When I was asked to give this Henry Beecher lecture, it was my way of saying how indebted I am to him, how much I respect what he's done, but also to note that we've made some progress since Henry Beecher's day. One of the areas of progress is recognizing that researcher conscience is an inadequate basis for protecting human subjects.
The common rule, as you likely know, is under consideration for some revisions. There was an NPRM with a few proposed changes, and there is some sense that an NPRM, a new rule making proposal, will be issued shortly from the Department of Health and Human Services. Putting aside those specific recommendations in the NPRM or in the ANPRM, what 2 or 3 changes do you think would most improve subject protections under the common rule?
Oh, that's a huge question. I think we need to affirm a version of the Belmont report that makes clear that both respect for persons and justice are irrevocable obligations that must be met and not traded off against utility maximizing. Here, I directly differ from my colleague Tom Beecham, who would balance all of these. In my view, respect for persons and justice were latecomers to the ethics of medicine. They were latecomers to the ethics of human subjects protection. But to me, they are the fundamental moral obligations. Of course, we try to do things that are beneficial on balance, but you can't in the process violate either respect for persons or justice. I would like to see some specific changes that I've mentioned. I think we need to do away with the waiver of informed consent. I think it's an anomaly that is totally inconsistent with respect for persons. I think we need to deal with a requirement that insurance be provided for compensation from injury. Number of things we've discussed. The most radical is probably this notion that it's rational for subjects to prefer the experimental arm in a randomized trial, even though investigators are in equipoise. All of those, ideally, for me, would be part of the new common rule.
I know one of the issues that was raised in the ANPRM dealt with consent to the use of tissue. And many, many years ago, I heard you talk about a case study you gave to students at Vassar that involved discarded tissue and the issue of whether or not those students would care about the uses to which discarded tissue was put. And I wonder if you'd briefly summarize for us your view on consent to the use of de-identified tissue.
story that you're talking about began as a research protocol where investigators, well, there are actually a couple of projects. In one case, investigators wanted to use remaindered blood left over in a bag after a transfusion's been given. And their view was, we're not going to identify the source. This is trash. We can throw it away afterwards. Who in their right mind would want to know about it? The other protocol involved the use of aborted fetuses, where once again, it was so-called trash, something that would normally be just discarded, and investigators wanted to use this trash, if I can use that word here, and thought that there was no reason to tell the sources of the trash that they were going to be part of a research project. The IRB that was reviewing these was split down the middle, with those who were more oriented to the research enterprise, who thought as long as nobody can be harmed, what difference does it make? We can use it and there's no point in getting consent because subjects can't be hurt. Some of the non-scientists on the IRB thought, no, wait a minute, maybe some subjects would like to know. And in the name of respect for our subjects, who are after all contributing the product under which the study would be done, we owe it to them to ask the question, would they want to be asked? At the same time, I was teaching a course, a bioethics course at Vassar. Most of the students were females still at Vassar. It used to be an all-girls school. And just for fun, I asked them about these examples and whether they would want to be asked if they were the sources of the material. Overwhelmingly, they wanted to be asked. Now, my take-home message was, it makes a huge difference what your reference group is when you're dealing with an informed consent problem, and the question is, how much do subjects want to be told? Those in the researcher framework thought there's no rational reason for wanting to be told. The IRB was divided. My students at Vassar overwhelmingly wanted to be told. The idea that because one cannot be injured, there's no further moral obligation to the subject, I think is a pernicious idea. It was in the early 1960s Department of Health, Education, and Welfare at the time, where you only triggered a review if there was a risk to subjects. My view is there are lots of things that subjects can be interested in, and if we're going to impose upon them to make a contribution to human subjects research, we owe it to them to ask the question. Now, I'm open to the possibility that there might be something that reasonable subjects wouldn't care to be asked about. And some of the new research on methods in evaluating alternative therapies that are just record searches. And if they're innocent record searches, and it would be very hard to ask subjects, I'm open to the possibility that our finding might be that reasonable subjects wouldn't care to be asked. But the key question is, would subjects want to be asked? And if a number of them would want to be asked, then in my view, they have a right to be asked. That applies to tissue samples, to remaindered blood, to medical records, anything where you have to concede there's no real risk to the subjects, but still subjects, if they're going to be a contributor to the research, have a right to be asked. I would apply that to post-mortem studies where if we haven't gotten the consent from the subject before death, we may have to ask surrogates surviving family members.
So much a part of your life, and certainly Primmer's organizational life, has been devoted to advancing ethical research and trying to figure out better ways, ever better ways to protect subjects. So my final question is, and it may have been asked and answered, but my final question is, if only you could do one thing or two things to improve the protection mechanisms in place to protect subjects, what would it or what would they be, if only?
Well, in my view, all research on human subjects needs to be subject to institutional review, and the review panel needs to be adequately representing the perspective of subjects. I think that means, as in the National Commission, having a substantial representation of lay people who clearly have different moral instincts than investigators. So I would expand the requirement for review to all research with human subjects, and I would expand the requirements for institutional review boards so that the subject's perspective is adequately represented.
You are a guiding light for the field, and for me, you've been an inspiration from afar, and it's been pure privilege to have you be an inspiration from a near. Thank you so much for sitting down with us today.